Hi. In this video, we're going to be talking about the animal phylum Arthropoda, or arthropods. Arthropods, as you can see, includes things like crustaceans, such as crabs and lobsters, insects like ants and butterflies, and spiders, and a whole host of other organisms. Let's start with some of their basic classification information. So, as you know, we've been talking about a lot of bilateral animals. Arthropods are no different. They show bilateral symmetry, which means they have cephalization, or in other words, a head, and they have body parts in pairs, which allows for more advanced development. Arthropods are triploblastic. Remember, that means they have all three tissue layers. And on that note, they're also coelomates. So they have a full body cavity completely lined with mesoderm, and they demonstrate protostome development. So they develop their mouth first when they undergo gastralization, and they follow the embryonic pattern of development found in protostomes. All arthropods have three major characteristics that really identify them as a group. The first one is that they have an exoskeleton. They also demonstrate segmentation. And finally, as their name implies, they have jointed appendages. Let's start by talking about exoskeletons. So arthropods have exoskeletons made of chitin. Chitin, if you recall, is a polysaccharide, and it's the same polysaccharide that we find in the cell walls of fungi. This is really awesome, but it also presents some challenges. So number one, because having an exoskeleton is pretty much like wearing a suit of armor, like the kind knights would wear out of metal, only this one's made out of chitin, it makes it a little bit difficult when they get super big because that suit of armor becomes super heavy. And so consequently, this limits their size. It also limits their size because of the way muscles attach. We'll talk about that in a bit. They also have to molt to grow. This makes them members of the group Ecdysozoa. Ecdysozoa also includes the nematodes. Remember, they have a outer coating of a cuticle. Arthropods have their exoskeleton, both of which are required to be shed when they need to get bigger. This is kind of akin to when you were little, your mom buying you some shoes that were just a little bit too big, or pants that were a little bit too big so that you could grow into them. So arthropods, after they molt, they grow a new exoskeleton, and it's just a little bit too big, and that allows them a little wiggle room to grow. But if they grow out of that wiggle room, they have to shed their exoskeleton. This presents a problem because, number one, in the period in which they are growing a new exoskeleton, they're very vulnerable to predators because, of course, that exoskeleton gives them some defense. And number two, it also limits their movement because their muscles pull on their exoskeleton. So they're very, very vulnerable in the time period in which they're growing a new exoskeleton. Thankfully, they're able to grow the new one under the old one, and then as they grow, they kind of shimmy out of the new one. So another of the characteristics that arthropods share is that they are segmented. So most arthropods have three main body parts: the head, abdomen, and thorax. So the head is obvious. The thorax is the part where our heart is. We call that our thoracic cavity. Arthropods have the thorax in a similar location, just under their head. And then finally, they have their abdomen. Our abdominal cavity is where we would find most of our digestive organs, our liver, our reproductive structures, and that would be the same for the arthropods as well. Notice, though, that the distinction we see in most of the arthropods, we see that great variety of layouts, but they all kind of have the same structure. Well, almost all of them. Some of them have very unclear boundaries between where the head is and where the thorax is. For those, we call that part the cephalothorax. We would find that in spiders as well as in crustaceans such as the lobster. The last major characteristic is pretty significant. In fact, it's what they are named for. So arthropods all have jointed appendages. Arthropod literally means jointed foot. To help you remember that, think of arthritis, which is a common ailment that a lot of people have. It's an inflammation of the joints. Arthro means joints. So arthropod means jointed foot. Arthropods have a great variety of appendages. Look at this ventral side of the crayfish. In addition to having the pinchers that a lot of you are familiar with and the walking legs that they use to move around, they have appendages to help them feed. They have appendages that help them sense their environment, others that help them swim and reproduce. They even have appendages to help them steer. And so there's a great variety. And these are all that have different adaptations, allowing for arthropods to have a great variety of niches that they can adapt to. Additionally, all these appendages means they have much more complex movement. Arthropods have muscles that attach to the inside of their exoskeleton. Now, this is great, it gives them strength, but remember that exoskeleton can get really heavy, and this arrangement of muscles does limit their size. Additionally, when we talk about arthropods and their joints, we also have to talk about their movement. And arthropods are one of a very small group of animals that can fly. So, of course, that's pretty special too. Let's take a moment and review. To study arthropods further, we need to talk about their body systems. So let's start with the digestive tract. So their digestion is much more complex than some of the other invertebrates. Like annelids, they have a complex digestive tract. So they have a one-way gut, a separate mouth, and an anus. And they also have a lot of the structures that are more familiar to us when we start talking about digestion. A mouth, a pharynx, a stomach of some sort, an intestine, an anus. They also have a number of parts, very specialized mouth parts. Some of them have appendages to help them get their food. As we look at the bottom here, we have some that chew their food, others that suck, like a butterfly. Some, of course, are more of a stinging, like an insect. And so we have a great variety of mouth parts depending upon how the animal feeds. So when we look at their mouth parts, there's a couple we need to be familiar with. So a mandible is kind of like what we have. We have a mandible. Ours goes up and down. Arthropod mandibles tend to go side to side, but it's basically a hinged jaw. Spiders have what we call chelicera. Chelicera are those two things here, and they help the spiders get their food. And there's a great variety, as I begin to mention, as I showed you these, a great variety of mouth parts. Let's pause to finish our notes and also to review. As we would expect with the more advanced animals, certainly those that are on land for sure, we have a circulatory system. However, most arthropods have an open circulatory system. So remember that means that a heart pumps and keeps the blood flowing, but the blood opens up into a general cavity, and so the oxygen-rich blood mixes with the oxygen-poor. It's not quite as efficient as a closed circulatory system. The reason why the pump is going is mostly for delivering food and removing waste, although certainly respiration is a factor. There's a great variety of respiratory strategies depending upon the arthropod's lifestyle. So some are, of course, marine arthropods living in the water. They're going to have different needs than those living on land. Of course, living on land presents challenges, including getting oxygen differently than earlier animals have in the water, where they've been able to get it straight from the water. So, as we would expect with a lot of aquatic animals, we see that those that live in the water tend to have gills. What's really cool is those gills are attached to their walking legs, and so their walking legs help them breathe. Those that live on land may have other strategies. So some insects have what we call a tracheal tube. Tracheal tube is kind of like our lungs, in that they have our trachea goes into smaller and smaller tubes, essentially, that then eventually are exposed to our blood. Tracheal tubes work the same way, that they branch into smaller tubes and eventually get oxygen to the insect. Book lungs are a lot more like our lungs. They have tracheal tubes, but then they also have a lung system that's folded, which is why it's called a book lung. Pause if you need to, and then also let's review. Living on land also presents a problem with excretion because we need to be really careful about the water content of animals that live on land. So arthropods that live on land typically have what we call Malpighian tubes. They're modified nephridia. Remember, nephridia are what annelids use, and those they help arthropods filter out waste from their bodies. So they'll use active transport, in other words, energy, to pull the waste out into these tubes, which are what we call the Malpighian tubes, and then they dump the waste in the hind gut. So the hind gut would be this section back here, and then it goes to the same place digestive waste does, and that is out the anus. This is because of the need to be independent of water. In that process, they're able to reabsorb any water that they need to help control their water content, and that allows them to be more independent of water. In the water, however, they don't need to be quite as stingy with their water, so they have nephridia, much like the annelids have. We will see in the crayfish dissection, when we do that in class, that they have a structure known as green glands that are for excretion. Being fairly complex invertebrates means that arthropods have a pretty advanced nervous system. However, they do share several similarities with the other invertebrates that we've studied. So like the other invertebrates, they have two ventral nerve cords. So in other words, two nerve cords running down their belly side. And their sensory information is processed by ganglia. The control of the different body parts is mostly done at the segment level. However, they do have advanced senses. Arthropods need to move around in their environment. We talked about that complex movement, which requires that they be very aware of their environment. So one adaptation that arthropods have is some pretty complex eyes. Specifically, they have what we call compound eyes. Compound eyes are called compound eyes because they're made up of multiple lenses, sometimes hundreds or thousands or many thousands of lenses. It's a myth, though, that they see, like if they were looking at a tree, each lens would see a tree. They're pointed in somewhat different directions, so it's kind of like a pixelated computer image. Each lens sees just a part of the image. Now, they're not as detailed as ours. It seems like they should be, but they're not. So when we see something there, it's about the best insects see about 1/60th as well as us in terms of the image they're able to create. So if we can see something from 60 feet away, they can't see that similar image until they're about 1 foot away. But what they are really good at seeing is sensing motion. So some insects that live in colonies that need to communicate do so by communicating through motion, their flight patterns, for example. They're also really good at seeing UV rays. We can't see that, but they can. And so they're able to detect flowers in different stages of pollination because of that. Additionally, they can see color. That's one of the reasons why flowers are colored. Some, however, have simple eyes. So simple eyes aren't simple because they're not complex. They're simple because they just have one lens. Our eyes are technically considered simple because we have one lens, though they're very different from spiders. Spiders have paired lenses, and so we only have two. They have many pairs, sometimes 8 or more. And those pair lenses each have different functions. When we talk about senses, we should also talk about sound. So they have what we call a tympamum, which is a primitive eardrum. They are able to detect sound, though it would not be their primary sense organ. They also, as you're familiar, hopefully, some crustaceans and insects have antennae. So an antenna is a sensory appendage. It's able to detect chemicals, so smell. It's also able to detect touch. When we talk about chemicals, we should also mention pheromones. So pheromone is a chemical signal. Humans have pheromones that we're not really aware of. Dogs are looking for pheromones when they mark their territory. They're marking with chemicals that they detect. That many insects communicate with pheromones as well. Pause here if you need to catch up on your notes. Let's also quickly review. The last body system we'll talk about is reproduction. A lot of the anatomical organs of an arthropod are very similar to that of an annelid and some of the other invertebrates. And even some of the vertebrates. Arthropods have sperm ducts and oviducts and ovaries and testes, all of which are very, very similar to what we'll see in other phyla. However, their reproductive habits are often very unique. So, as you hopefully learned probably in elementary school, arthropods undergo metamorphosis. Lots of invertebrates do, but arthropods kind of are the crowning example. Of course, there's butterflies to caterpillars, but really most arthropods undergo some kind of metamorphosis. Not all, but a good deal of them. Many of the arthropods have separate sexes. In fact, most do. There are very few hermaphrodites, although there are some. Whether fertilization is internal or external depends largely on whether arthropods live on land or on water. So on land, drying out is always going to be a concern. And so if you're an arthropod that lives on land, you can't just lay eggs and then have a male come along and fertilize them because the eggs will dry out. And so instead there's internal fertilization. In the water, it could go either way because external fertilization is a possibility, though some do still do internal fertilization. Um, Most males, regardless of whether they live in water or not, make what we call spermatophores, and these are basically little waterproof packets. And so when they fertilize the female, um, they're they're not going to mix the sperm with anything else. Some of them have some pretty advanced reproductive strategies. So some incubate the eggs. So here's a crayfish, and the swimmerets, those are the little legs underneath them, are used for holding on to the eggs. Some insects, like bees, actually care for their young. Scorpions, interestingly, actually give birth to live eggs. The eggs hatch internally, and then they do provide care for their offspring, just like bees do. Bees have very complex mating rituals. If they're a colony bee, they have a queen bee. The queen bee is the one that lays the eggs. She can control whether they're male or female. The males pretty much exist only for fertilization and reproduction, and so it's the females that mostly are throughout the colony. So very, very interesting reproductive strategies. If you're interested, I encourage you to look at them further than we have time for in class. So we're going to dissect the crayfish in class, and it's a really very, very cool anatomy that we'll be able to see. But keep in mind that what we dissect, the crayfish, is just an example. There's great diversity as we look at the different kinds of arthropods. Let's take a moment and review reproduction in arthropods. Arthropods are incredibly important phyla, as far as important to humans as well as to the ecosystem at large. So arthropods' importance comes from a number of different things. Number one, arthropods are a food source. They're a prey species. Lots of animals rely on eating arthropods, including humans, by the way. We eat crustaceans quite a bit, and some insects, but mostly crustaceans. Arthropods are a source of money. Honey, for example, is a tremendous industry. What you've been hearing about a lot in the news is the importance of arthropods on pollination. So arthropods, bees, but others as well, are heavily involved in pollination. It's estimated that a third of the food we eat is reliant on arthropods to, actually on bees to pollinate it. There's a tremendous economic component of the service that bees do in pollinating our crops, $15 billion annually. These are not numbers you need to know, but just the sheer importance of arthropods, in particular insects and bees, on our economy and on our food supply is incredibly valuable and incredibly in jeopardy. The bee population has been tremendously affected by pesticide use. When we use pesticides are indiscriminate. They kill lots of species at large, and so the bee population's gone down a lot, really putting in danger our ability to produce crops. There is, of course, a downside to arthropods as well, and that is they can spread disease. Tapeworm, malaria, heartworm, Lyme's disease, the Zika virus, they're all spread by a vector, in particular mosquitoes. So they don't infect the mosquitoes, but the larva can be spread person to person via the mosquito. And so there's a very large concern about the mosquito population, especially in light of recent Zika outbreaks. When we talk about their ecological importance, we also have to talk about their sheer abundance. 70 to 85% of all of the identified species in the world, not just animal species, but just species of organisms in general, are arthropods, specifically insects. So if we take a look, here's all of life as we know it. Plants take up a huge chunk, and we got some animals in there, bacteria, algae, protists. Here's what we think of animals. Here are including the invertebrates. All of these are arthropods, and this giant chunk are just insects alone, so they are incredibly abundant. Let's pause for a moment to review arthropod ecological importance. Along with the abundance comes a sheer diversity of arthropods. Here's an arthropod cladogram, and notice the clade of arthropod includes a number of different subgroups. Some of them are classes, and others are different ways of grouping them. So we're going to talk about a few different subphyla. So they're too big to be a class, they're subphyla. So we have crustaceans. Crustaceans such as the lobster, the crab, the shrimp, they're known for a number of characteristics. Number one, they have two segments, so the head and the thorax are combined into the cephalothorax. They are mostly marine, and they have chewing parts, so mandibles. Remember, the mandibles go side to side. And they often have two pair of antennae. Additionally, they have a lot of different appendages, including walking legs. Remember, in the crayfish, the walking legs also help with respiration. And they often have claws. Okay. When they reproduce, they have free-swimming larvae, and their exoskeleton is often a lot tougher. If you've ever had some seafood, sometimes they serve it with a hammer so you can get it out of the exoskeleton. And they have compound eyes. This is a lot of information, and I don't expect you to know all of this about crustaceans. Just be familiar with some of them. We've also mentioned Chelicerata. Chelicerata are, of course, the spiders and the scorpions. And once again, they're named for their fangs, or their pinchers. These guys right here. A lot of times those are connected to a poison gland, so you've probably heard of certain spiders being poisonous spiders. That's where they would be connected to. Many of them are part of the group Arachnia, so that would be like the spiders and the scorpions. And they have pedipalps, so they are tools used this right up here, also in front over here. They're used to help hold their prey. And as you probably learned in elementary school, they have 8 walking legs. They also lack antennae, typically have 2 body segments, and simple eyes. Once again, this is a lot of information, and I don't expect you to know all of this. Just kind of the overall theme. Finally, we have insects, and insects are the most diverse. And as you notice, there's a lot of different kinds. Some of them, of course, can fly, others cannot. We have a group called Euramina, which is essentially the insects. It also includes millipedes and centipedes. Quick side note, millipedes and centipedes don't have 1,100 legs, they just have a lot of legs. 80% of the arthropods are insects, and they're highly adapted for their movement strategies, for their digestive habits, and for their just overall life cycle. Some characteristics, though, that all insects share. Number one is they have 1 antenna pair, unlike the crustaceans that have 2. They have the 3 body segments, head, abdomen, and thorax. They typically have 2 pairs of wings, and they are the only arthropods that can fly. And they also have additional hair-like structures, not all of them, but many of them, that can sense vibration. And finally, once again, this is a lot of information. I only expect you to know the overall gist. Let's pause for a review of insect diversity. That's it for this video and for our arthropod notes. As always, make sure you come see me if you have any questions.